Have you ever noticed that the people who hurt you the most are often the ones who find their way back? Not right when you'd expect it, and never when you're braced for it. It usually happens months later, sometimes years later, right when you finally started to feel okay again. Most people assume this is just a coincidence, bad timing, or a random text sent at midnight. But once you understand what's actually happening underneath, you start to notice it isn't random at all. It follows a pattern, a quiet and almost invisible rhythm that repeats itself across relationship after relationship. Once you recognize this pattern, it becomes almost impossible to unsee it again. Maybe you've experienced this yourself, more than once, in more than one relationship. Maybe someone left without any real explanation and then reappeared as if nothing had happened between you. Maybe they always seemed to sense the exact moment you were finally starting to move on. Maybe you've spent hours asking what you did wrong when the real question was never really about you. Maybe you've quietly blamed yourself for still feeling something when they resurfaced, even after everything they had already put you through. If you're enjoying this conversation, consider subscribing for more psychology explained simply. So let's actually talk about why this happens so often and what's really driving it beneath the surface. The surprising part is that it's rarely about love in the way we usually imagine love. Psychology often reveals something very different from what a situation looks like on the outside. What looks like longing can sometimes actually be a loss of control. What seems like missing you may really be missing what you once provided them. To understand this fully, we need to look at what these people actually need from the people around them, and we need to understand why that need never really seems to disappear. At the center of this pattern is something researchers often call emotional supply, the attention, admiration, and reaction a person depends on to feel stable inside. Not love exactly, and not real connection either, but something closer to constant reassurance. This reassurance can come from praise, from conflict, or even from someone's visible sadness, since any strong reaction can serve the same purpose. Most people build their sense of self from somewhere inside themselves. Someone caught in this pattern often builds it from the outside instead, using other people as mirrors for their own worth. When that mirror suddenly disappears, something inside them starts to destabilize almost immediately. And that destabilizing moment is usually where the return quietly begins to take shape. But that's only where this story actually begins. Think about a couple you might know, or maybe even your own story from the past. One partner cycles endlessly between affection and coldness, warmth followed by long stretches of silence. There's praise one week, followed by sharp criticism the next, with almost no warning in between. And every single time the other person finally starts to pull away, something predictable tends to happen. A message arrives out of nowhere, or an old memory suddenly gets brought back up. A door that seemed permanently closed somehow finds a way to open again. At first, this can feel like fate stepping in at just the right moment.
Over time, though, it starts to feel like a pattern with a rhythm you could almost predict in advance. Because that's exactly what it is once you learn to see it clearly. These people don't usually track calendars, but they do seem to track emotional energy closely. They notice, almost instinctively, when someone's attention slowly starts drifting towards something else. They notice when the silence stops feeling painful and starts feeling like peace instead. And that particular shift is often the exact signal that quietly pulls them back in. This is where things start becoming even more interesting than they first appeared. There's a term for this exact pattern, and psychologists often call it hoovering. Like a vacuum, it pulls someone steadily back into a familiar emotional orbit. And it rarely happens when things are actually going well for the person doing it. It happens instead when their supply is running low somewhere else in their life. Or it happens when they sense that your supply is finally starting to run dry. What looks like kindness in that exact moment may actually be a kind of avoidance underneath. It's avoidance of losing access to something they've quietly come to depend on, which is you. Consider how this same pattern shows up inside an ordinary workplace. A manager dismisses an employee's ideas for months without much thought or care, then suddenly praises that same employee the moment they start interviewing somewhere else entirely. Consider a friendship where someone disappears completely for half a year without a word, then reappears exactly when you post that your life is finally going well again. Consider a parent who criticizes a child's choices relentlessly for years on end, then floods that child with sudden affection the moment they begin pulling away emotionally. Different settings, different people, and yet somehow the same underlying mechanism at work. Even a casual acquaintance can fit this pattern, resurfacing right after you stop replying to their messages. Notice how the timing rarely lines up with genuine change, only with a sense of losing access to you. Our minds naturally want to believe that a return automatically means something has changed. Many people unknowingly interpret reappearance as a genuine remorse or growth. But someone caught in this pattern often isn't processing loss the way most people do. One common psychological idea researchers describe is that they rarely grieve the relationship itself. Instead, they seem to grieve losing the function that person used to serve them. That small distinction matters far more than it might sound like at first, because it means the return usually isn't about you as a specific person. It's about what you represented to them, like attention, admiration, or a steady audience. It's about the sense of control that your presence quietly gave them back. And when that same function becomes available somewhere else entirely, something interesting happens next. The interest in returning to you can vanish just as quickly as it appeared. But that's still only part of a much larger and layered story.
There's another layer that most people never fully notice or understand at all, and it has everything to do with the surprisingly precise timing of these returns. These people tend to reappear right when someone finally begins to genuinely heal. Why would that particular timing happen so consistently, almost like clockwork every single time? Because healing usually looks like distance from the outside, even when it feels like relief. And distance, to someone who relies heavily on external validation, can feel like a real threat. It isn't that they can somehow read your mind from far away. It's that emotional withdrawal tends to show up in small, quiet, visible ways. Fewer replies arrive, conversations grow shorter, and warmth slowly starts to fade from your tone. To most people, that shift feels like hard-won peace after a long struggle. To someone caught in this pattern, it can feel like their supply is disappearing entirely. This is where the whole situation starts becoming even more interesting to examine. Psychologists often describe this dynamic using something called the supply cycle in relationships. It typically moves through 3 recognizable stages, one after another, in sequence. First comes idealization, where you're placed on a pedestal and showered with attention. Second comes devaluation, where criticism, coldness, or emotional withdrawal slowly begins to appear. Third comes the discard, where the relationship seems to end entirely and completely. But there's often a hidden 4th stage that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. That stage is the return, and importantly, it's almost never random or accidental. It tends to happen precisely when they sense their access to you disappearing for good. The deeper truth underneath all of this is surprisingly simple once you see it clearly. It was never really about missing you as the person you actually are. It was about the experience of being missed by someone else entirely. That doesn't necessarily make someone a bad person in the way we usually assume. Often, it's simply the way they learned long ago to protect themselves emotionally. This is where we have to look closely at where this pattern originally came from. Many psychologists trace this kind of behavior back to early emotional conditioning in childhood. In some cases, a child receives affection only when they perform, achieve, or impress someone. In other cases, a child experiences neglect so consistent that a lesson gets learned early. They learn to seek validation wherever they can find it, since home never reliably offered it. Over time, this experience creates a fragile internal structure that carries into adulthood. On the surface, there's often confidence, and sometimes even a sense of grandiosity. Beneath that surface, though, there's frequently an intense fear of being forgettable or unlovable without something to offer. That's exactly why control becomes so important to someone shaped by this pattern. Not control in an obvious or aggressive sense necessarily, but something quieter and more subtle. It's control over how much emotional access other people are allowed to have, and it's control over how much emotional access they in turn allow themselves to have. This need for control isn't conscious at all, but something closer to a reflex built over many years. It shows up as a quiet discomfort whenever someone else's attention starts drifting somewhere new. That's why disappearance becomes so difficult for them to tolerate when it finally happens. When someone stops reacting, stops chasing, and stops offering the emotional charge they relied on. It isn't experienced as a simple breakup, but something closer to losing part of themselves, which explains why the return so often arrives at the worst possible moment for healing, and at the very same time, the best possible moment for quietly restoring their own supply. The interesting part comes next, once you understand how deeply this pattern tends to repeat.
This cycle rarely resolves on its own, mainly because the return itself usually works. Someone reaches back out after a long silence, testing whether the old connection still holds. The other person, still carrying unresolved feelings underneath, often responds without fully meaning to. And that response, even a small and seemingly harmless one, quietly resets the entire cycle again. This is why the pattern can repeat itself for years without either person fully realizing it. Not because either person involved is weak, foolish, or somehow lacking in judgment, but because the mechanism is built, even unconsciously, to exploit exactly the right moment. It targets the moment when someone finally becomes emotionally available again after real distance. So what can you actually do with all of this information moving forward? Not a checklist, and not some rigid 5-step plan promising instant results. Just a different, quieter way of noticing what's actually happening around you. The next time someone unexpectedly reappears after a long stretch of silence, pause first. Ask yourself honestly what might actually be happening beneath the surface of that return. Ask what seemed to change right before they suddenly decided to reach back out. Often, you'll discover the real answer isn't about you as a person at all. It's about what they sensed slipping away and what they felt they were losing. Notice the timing carefully and reflect on the pattern instead of reacting immediately to it. Try to understand what's genuinely being requested in that reappearance, spoken or unspoken, between you. And then respond, not out of old habit, but from a clearer and more grounded place inside yourself. This doesn't mean shutting every door permanently or treating every reappearance as proof of something sinister. It simply means pausing long enough to ask what the return is actually asking of you. This same underlying pattern shows up in places well beyond just romantic relationships between two people. It shows up in friendships that only resurface the moment you finally start succeeding. It shows up in family members who suddenly reconnect right when you stop needing their approval. It shows up in workplaces where recognition mysteriously appears the moment you stop chasing it. At the same time, this pattern shows up in smaller, quieter ways inside your own life, too. In moments when you notice yourself reaching out only after someone else has pulled away. Understanding this pattern in other people often means recognizing faint echoes of it in ourselves. Not because we're all the same, but because seeking validation in small doses is deeply human. The difference lies in degree, not in kind, and that's worth sitting with honestly for a moment. Most people can tolerate someone else's silence without needing to chase it back into noise. Understanding people more clearly doesn't mean excusing every single behavior they choose to engage in. It means seeing things clearly enough to stop mistaking a pattern for a personal miracle. A return isn't always growth, and it isn't always a sign of real change. Sometimes it's simply gravity, quietly pulling someone back toward a source of supply they weren't ready to lose. Sometimes awareness genuinely changes everything, not because it fixes the other person involved. It changes things because it gives you back your own sense of timing and control. You slowly stop waiting for their return to mean something it was never actually meant to mean. You stop interpreting reappearance as remorse and start seeing it for the pattern it really is. And slowly, the door that once felt impossible to close starts to feel more like a choice. The greatest shift usually begins the moment an invisible pattern finally becomes visible to you. Because once you can truly see it, you're no longer just reacting to it automatically. You're recognizing it clearly for what it has always actually been underneath. And recognition, more than any single decision you make, is usually where real change quietly begins. If this perspective helped you see something differently today, consider subscribing for more conversations exactly like this one. Thank you sincerely for spending these thoughtful moments here with me today. I'll see you again soon in the very next video we share together.